I'd be like, "Hey, what's in scope?" "Oh, everything's in scope." And I'll say, "Well, great. I'm gonna throw a brick through your window at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday." "Well, you absolutely can't do that." Like, okay. So now we're negotiating what's in scope, right?
All right, welcome to another fantastic Red Siege SiegeCast. I'm Tim Medin, CEO of Red Siege. With me, I have Jason Downey. Jason, thanks for hopping on here.
Yeah. Happy to be here. I mean, I really enjoy the social engineering stuff. And hey, if we can make it a little bit better for all of our red team friends and how to conduct themselves in a way that makes sense, like I'm happy to do it.
Absolutely, absolutely. In this SiegeCast, we're going to be talking through some of the ethical, legal considerations related to offense, whether that be pen testing, red teaming, social engineering, physical assessments, whatever that might be. Let's start off with the sort of simpler question related to the legal aspects. Jason, what's the biggest consideration when it comes to the legal aspect on making it, well, legal or frankly illegal?
Yeah. Well, for me personally, when I'm doing physical engagements, the number one thing on my mind is how can I do this without going to jail? Because the last thing that I want to do is call Tim at 2 o'clock in the morning and be like, "Hey, I hope we have bail money in the Red Siege Fund to get me out of here." So the first place that we want to start is like the true basics of permission. Discussing with the client, what am I allowed to do on what days, what specific times am I allowed to perform these operations? If I have my get out of jail free card, basically it's a predefined letter that says, "Hey, I'm authorized to do this activity," and it says I'm supposed to end at 6 o'clock. I'm not pushing that. I turn into a magic pumpkin at 6:01, right? Like I'm going to be out of there by 5:58, or if not earlier, because I do not want to go to jail and then violate my client and all that jazz.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is just not specific to the physical social engineering. This is any
Yeah.
kind of pen testing. You don't send packets until you're authorized to do so. You don't perform any of those attacks. I mean, the Computer Fraud and the Abuse Act, which we have here in the U.S., refers to unauthorized access to a computer system. So the only difference between the good guys and the bad guys is permission. I don't care what type of test you're doing. The only difference here is permission. You can mean well. You could hope to make the organization better with whatever you're testing, but the only difference between the good folks and the bad is that permission. And it doesn't matter what kind of testers you're doing. When it comes to the phone calls, though, we do have to be concerned a little bit about how we proceed with that. Jason, what are the considerations related to some of the phone calls and documentation of?
So at least in the United States specifically, every state kind of defines wiretapping laws, and the part that really pertains to us is when it comes to party consent. A lot of our states have one party consent, where if one person on the phone agrees that it can be recorded, then it can be legally recorded. Obviously, federal wiretapping law says if zero people on the call are the ones recording it, that's a big problem. Where it gets kind of tricky is some states have two-party consent laws where each person on the call has to consent in order for it to be recorded, which is why sometimes when you call a 1-800 number, it's like this call is being recorded for quality assurance. That's you basically saying that you are agreeing while the employee signs some kind of employee agreement saying that they can be. But ultimately, back in the day when area codes actually pertain to the area that they were in, you could probably get away with it. But now, how telephony routes all over the place, it's almost never ever worth risking it thinking that it's only going to fall into a single party consent state. Because if it crosses that line, like we mentioned previously, you're in trouble. And that's Fed boy trouble. And we don't want any of that.
Yeah, and it gets additionally confusing. Like if I live in a one-party state, and if I call somebody that's in a two-party state, the more restrictive regulations is the one that we fall under. So I can't
Mhm.
say like, "Hey, I recorded this conversation to demonstrate what happened during our social engineering engagement." I can't do that because the other person was not informed. And it could be that the person also lives in Texas, but now has their cell phone and they're physically in a different state. And now the game changes. So we have to be very careful with that. And our common recommendation is unless you absolutely know, like you're calling the help desk who's in a physical building, and of course they want this kind of documentation, just don't bother because it can get relatively sticky relatively quickly. And if there's any sort of anything that happens back to that employee, we'll talk about that in a little bit. It could come back and say, "Hey, you weren't authorized to record that conversation. You have caused me damages," and it's a non-trivial type of charge, not one I want to play with. I like to avoid lawyers and courts because it's
Yes.
not fun.
Yep.
Cool. So, as I mentioned, Jason is one of our social engineering experts here. One of the things that we have to do when we're doing social engineering, and this can be phone calls, this can be in person, this is honestly your emails, chat, whatever it might be. What we're doing here is we're lying to people, right? We're convincing them that you're supposed to be there, they're supposed to give you this information. And at least in my mind, it's okay. I don't consider this like a moral dilemma here because it's part of the game. Just like when you're playing poker, bluffing is part of the game. You don't get mad at the people at the poker table with you, your friends or enemies, whatever, because they bluffed. It's part of the rules of the game. And if the organization is telling people, hey, we're going to do these phone calls, they're now, in a way, read into the game. Now, I'm not pretending it's that simple, but what are some of the other considerations we have associated with that beyond just the trickery employed during the social engineering?
Yeah, when you talk about that morality of sometimes, right? Like whether I'm, lying to someone's email or lying to someone's, over the phone call or lying to them face to face. And sometimes people ask me, like, how do you sleep at night? And it's like, well, at the end of the day, like I'm fighting for the users, right? Like I am pushing to make environments more secure. And sometimes that means telling a small lie in the same way that when we're doing, technical penetration tests, like I'm in their network acting like a jerk in sort of the idea that if you can't see me being a jerk now, you're not going to see the actual jerk, the real bad guy when they're doing the same behavior. And so that's how at the root of it, I'm still able to sleep at night. Like I am lying to you, and we'll kind of talk into some revisits to people later to try to cover some of that stuff. But yeah, that's how I'm able to sleep at night. And then but we still have to operate within the confines of we talked about like the permissions. The client really sets what they want done, and if they say like, "Hey, we want XYZ, I can't do ABC because I think it's going to work."
Yeah.
I am violating the trust that we have between us and our clients.
Yeah, and the social engineering.org or whatever it is, they have their code of ethics. And I think it's a good basis from which we can start here. Like, for example, if you're making the phone call or email in person, whatever, yes, we're tricking them. I'm not pretending we're not. And that, if you lie to a computer, you're not going to hurt its feelings, right? Whereas if during our ruse, our pretext, whatever, we trick a person, there could be feelings hurt. Um, with that, we have some ethics associated with that. The bad guys, they are already violating the law, so they don't care, right? But for us as social engineers, we have certain things that we don't want to do to impose a negative impact on the person. Like, for example, I don't want to be like, "Hey, something bad happened to your family, your kid, your somebody else. Hey, this is an emergency. I'm calling from the ER. I need blah blah blah." Something like that. That's not okay. Now, would a bad guy do it? Absolutely. We're not the bad guys. We have certain ethical lines that we need to follow because once you cross that, we start getting into to issues here, and realistically, we're not making the organization better off. Jason, what's your thoughts on that?
I have a very strong, uh, I guess, opinion in the fact that we should not use fear as a pretext. If
Agreed.
our real goal is to make someone better, fear is not how we do that. Obviously, if my goal is to truly extort somebody, then sure, fear is probably a great thing. But the end of the conversation or the engagement, if I want that person, that company, that department, that whoever to improve, I can't leave them with a bad taste in their mouth. So there's a certain technique, if you will, to lying to somebody, then revisiting and saying like, hey, you still did a good job. Here's this where you could do better for next time, and here's some training and yada yada. And we also have to consider sometimes like the unforeseen impact of who or what we're impersonating. We have to be mindful about, if I'm pretending to be some kind of like city official and I go into a place, or I'm a fire inspector, I'm here to do fire things, right? That you can get in a lot of trouble with that because you're impersonating a government official. No client can give me permission to do that. If a client has a partnership with another business or organization and I'm impersonating that third party and sending something malicious, yeah, the security team, my point of contact knows, but do the business folks, will they ever get word that's what happened, or they just look bad because I'm impersonating who that is? So a lot of times, especially in phishing and whatnot, instead of impersonating a real company, I'll make a fake one up and a mock page that does something similar to who I want to impersonate.
Yeah, and related to that too, going back to the we don't want to have the negative impact on the person. And I remember, this is not too terribly long ago for for all of us, most of us, COVID, right? Like we made a decision, like we weren't going to do phishing emails associated with that because we didn't want people to, you know, not get the proper medical information because they're like, well, that could be a fish. Or, for example, what happens now if you impersonate a charity? Now, if you're impersonating a charity, the potential negative impact is one, first off, you've got brand impersonation. That's a technically an IP infringement piece. But on top of that, let's say I'm impersonating something like the United Way. What happens now if Jason clicks on that email and he's like, "Oh, I got caught by that United Way phishing," and then in the future doesn't make donations to, and I'm just picking United Way here, but fill in the blank cause, which could
Mhm.
actually make the community, the world better. And people don't take that action because, well, now that's clearly a fish. So there's lines beyond just the legal piece. There's what are the moral obligations to, in some sense, to society? Maybe this is delusions of grandeur, but there are some important aspects here because I don't want people to not donate to their local community, to different charities. Those things make our society a lot better. Cool. Let's jump now into some of the physical pieces here. So Jason does a bunch of our physical. We've got a few folks on our team that do that. But with the physical, this game changes a little bit, right? When I'm hacking from my house, I can't touch the computers. I can't physically damage them, right? Like, what are some of the issues there related to some of that with physicals?
Sure. Yeah, I mentioned earlier with obviously myself in mind that I don't want to get arrested, right? That's
Yeah.
that's number one as a pen
Nope.
tester. But for our clients, things are a little bit different. And I really always try before I ever get to the site is to understand what I like to call their appetite for destruction. It's funny because sometimes we'll be on kickoff calls, and I actually stole this from Mike, where I'd be like, "Hey, what's in scope?" Like, "Oh, everything's in scope." And I'll say, "Well, great. I'm gonna throw a brick through your window at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday." "Well, you absolutely can't do that." Like, "Okay." So now we're negotiating what's in scope, right? Like we know what the extremes are, and we're gonna meet somewhere in the middle. Works surprisingly well. Um, but in the same way that like with your with the vishing and phishing that Tim just talked about, we have the potential to cause actual damage to physical devices, especially if we're doing things like lock picking, or if we're like trying to take a badge reader off the wall and replace it. Those could all turn into extra costs, whether it be money or labor, for our client. And we have to be very cognizant of that on physical engagements. And I will sometimes double, triple check. Did you set it on the kickoff call? I'm getting ready to do it now. Is this okay? Can I hide in your stairwell? Can I block a fire door? Can I pick this lock? Can I use it under the door tool? All the cool things that we could do on those engagements. But we really have to be cognizant of our clients' appetite for destruction. So if they say no lock picking, that means no lock picking. That is the same issue as if a hospital says, don't test this subnet because it has breathing machines on
Oh
it
dear
and
God.
we can't do that. That also applies to things like picking locks.
Yeah, and there's to Jason's point, there's always that threshold there, right? Because if you're trying to get into a building, how successful are you going to be if you just rush in like a linebacker, start smashing windows, grabbing stuff, and getting out? Will you get away with stuff? Yeah, probably. But is that the goal? We have to go back to what is the fundamentals of the test. The goals are to test their procedures. Are their procedures being followed? Can you tailgate in? Drastically different than is your window, you know, brick proof?
Is it brick
That
proof?
doesn't make sense, right? If that's your threat
Right.
model, it's a whole different thing. Probably not going to throw a brick at it to test, but
Mm.
we've got to understand what are we trying to test here? Because if we start to deviate too much, we're no longer testing that, and we're sort of making up a scenario just to quote unquote win, but you're not providing any sort of value.
Sure. And then to double piggyback off that, right? We still want to be able to show our clients impact. And we want to do it in a way that makes sense without jeopardizing their stuff. For instance, I don't if I'm doing a network test and I've got, an employee's password, I'm not going to post that on the internet somewhere and be like, "Hey, this is what I could do," right? I
What a
really
stupid
don't
password.
Right. I really don't want to be the breach when it comes to someone's physical assets either, because there are times when I steal laptops or, top secret, well, not top secret, secret documents, confidential documents. I did one recently where I had a box of documents and I walked out to the lobby and I went to go down like the elevator with it and was like, I probably shouldn't leave with this. And so I turned and took it back inside. The proof of concept was there. I showed them that I could take it. They got it. I didn't have to go outside and take it back to my hotel room because if I had done something, even like tripped and fell, and these documents like blew down the street or something, that would be a massive, like a massive issue for them because who knows who would have picked it up and read what and published what. So don't be the breach and don't do it on purpose and try to do everything to not do it on accident either.
Yeah, and that's not exclusive to this kind of assessment. We see this kind of thing in the network side of things. Don't take the data. If you need the data for the test, cool. Like you get a password and it's useful for the test, cool. Key, cool. Now, what doesn't help anybody is for you to take and download all the PII, PHI, intellectual property, whatever it is, and say, haha, I'll show you. Because now you've caused a problem. If you download the credit card information, you're now part of their PCI network, and you have to be a proper custodian. You have to demonstrate destruction. Everything else is now that computer touches is now in their PCI CDE. It gets really hairy very quickly. I went to a talk a number of years ago, and there was this younger pen tester, very excited. His passion was contagious. But during his presentation, he was talking and saying, "Hey, when I do my pen test, I like to take all the data to show the impact." And everybody in the room, 'cause if you think of it just at the surface level, you're like, "Yeah, that makes sense. You're demonstrating the risk." And it was another guy and myself, we are kind of looking at each other like, this isn't okay. And I was the jerk in the room, raised my hand. I said, look, if you do this at my company, I'm going to fire you on the spot. And if you're working for me as a pen tester, I will fire you on the spot because the risk is too high. He's like, yeah, but I'm demonstrating the risk. I'm not doing anything with it. Doesn't matter. You are now a custodian of that data, and you have to follow legal recommendations, compliance guidelines, etc., to manage that data, destroy that data, sanitize it, all sorts of nasty things. And it's just too big of a problem. Get close to that point. Like Jason said, take it to the lobby. Clearly, you can walk out the front door, flip around and
Don't.
flip a UE,
Right.
take it back inside. With that
Yeah.
data on the network, create some sample data that looks like the real data. Exfil that if you need to, but don't be the breach. The risk is just too high. There's fines for that kind of stuff. There is no, um, for like PHI healthcare information. Doesn't matter if you're a pen tester, you don't get a pass on HIPAA if you start grabbing that information. So you should just need to be very, very careful with that.
I always make it a point, so I treat client data like the plague. If I can't burn whatever it touches, then it probably shouldn't touch it. It doesn't touch my host machine. We spin up VMs, we spin up individual instances. It stays there. In an
Yeah.
engagement, we burn that stuff for good reason.
Yeah, I always make the joke with clients like, "Hey, your data is toxic waste to us. If
Yes,
I touch it, now I got to pull in the hazmat team, and we've got to clean this stuff up." Nobody wants that. Like, it's just the risk is too high. And honestly, I don't want the risk. I don't want the responsibility. I'm here for the pen test. I don't want more responsibility on top of that. That's just insane.
I agree.
So we talked a little bit about incentives and leaving the organization better off. I think the biggest we've touched on this in a number of different points so far. Um, One of the big things, and again, this goes back to the bad guys are going to do bad stuff, and they don't care if they cross those ethical lines because they're already crossing, of course, legal lines. Right? This is just another one. Who cares? So I think one of the biggest cases, or let me rephrase that. I think the most famous, the best case of this, not in a good way, was GoDaddy in December of 2020. So GoDaddy in December of 2020, if you remember 2020, there's a lot of lockdowns. We had a lot of social unrest. It was just a very uncomfortable, the political scheme. It was just this whole dark time, one of the darkest times, I think, collectively that we've all experienced in our lifetimes. And what they did is there was an email that went around and said, "Hey, you're going to get a bonus." December of 2020. And of course, a lot of people were like, "Oh, you know what? I could use that. Like, I'm having a tough time, stuck at home, all sorts of stuff's going on. It's just hard. This extra cash is going to be nice." Clicked on the email, like a user probably would. And then 2 days later, got an email that said, "You failed our recent phishing test." So that was a phishing assessment. Now, this was sent by their internal security team, people that they're supposed to trust. Jason, what do you think that did to morale at that organization and the impact?
I mean, I love my job at Red Siege. I don't know if Tim lied to me about getting a bonus. I might at least put an application in somewhere else. So I can only imagine how, that felt across the enterprise, at a time when,
Yeah.
when times were hard. I mean, that would have not sat very well with me as an employee. And one thing that I always try to do as a pen tester is I want to get my client to sign off on any phishing engagement. Hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Will this gel well with your C level? Will this gel with your HR? Because I know we as security people might think it's really cool, but how will it play with the rest of your organization? And I want to make sure that we've got real buy in before launching these kinds of campaigns, specifically because I don't want to be that jerk either.
Yeah. And like Jason's point, I read that there was people who left the organization. How much do you think it took to replace them from a just talking about the business side, the financial
Mhm.
side, the morale overall, right? And as security people, what do you think the feeling was of the rest of the GoDaddy people for security? They're like, yeah, report phishing emails. Screw you. I'm going to click on this one, right? And I'm going to click on it as many times as I freaking can, right? Like, what have you done? Yes, the bad guys would do the same thing, but they're bad guys. Now we're supposed to be colleagues working together towards this vision and blah blah blah. And now you've just sabotaged. So it can be kind of hard when we come up with ruses like this. So you see, for example, at like universities, if they ever do tests or experiments on live subjects, especially psychological tests, they go through this entire review board because there's been so many of those. One of the most famous cases was one where they took two random groups of students. You're the prisoners, you're the cops, and a few days in, the cops who weren't real cops were beating the prisoners who weren't real prisoners, but they were actually like beating them and yelling at them. And they're like, "Whoa, we got to stop this experiment." And you see stuff like that. So we got to take a step back. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but we got to take a step back and be like, "Hey, what's the actual implications here?" Right? Like, what is the potential outcomes from this? Maybe you get HR involved, legal, whatever kind of situation, just to make sure that you don't leave people worse off. Because that GoDaddy example is just fantastic and not in
Yeah.
a good way.
Yeah. And I know, especially from us as consultants, right? Like we essentially have to live by ripping and running. Like we have our client who has their paid time, and at the end of our paid time, we then move on to our next client. Whether that's 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever that engagement looks like. But our partnership, we really want to continue over the years. But it's really easy for us to be like, well, we don't have to deal for the fallout from this And so to not be cognizant of that, and we don't want to do that, right? Because we, like I said, we fight for the users. We want to make the world a better place, and we want to allow our clients to be able to build that relationship with their IT department, with their business, with their, frontline employees. And if we as consultants ruin that, that looks really bad on everybody across the board. You know, I
Yeah,
I
and go ahead.
I got to do like an on-site engagement recently, and it's one of the few times that I get to really interact with the front level employees at another company, being the consultant. And I know at the end of my engagement, we had some extra time, and I pretty much was like, "Hey, do you care if I go visit all of the people that I interacted with like today?" And sure, they gave me permission, and I got to do this couple hours of going and talking. "Hey, I ran into you on Tuesday," and I showed him my get out of jail free card. "This is who I am. I'm not who I said I was. This was the purpose of the engagement. The client really want to make a safer environment for you. This is why I did what I did. Here's what you did really well. Here's what you could improve on." And I really went above and beyond to not leave a bad taste in that employee's mouth, and they were so receptive to that. Like, "Oh, thank you for not, embarrassing me. Thank you for not calling me out. Thank you for not, making this hard. But it's really cool that my company is investing in my physical safety." And they really appreciated that. And tricked users can be the best allies. Like, that's the way to kind of buy them
Yes.
in, as long as you don't embarrass them, as long as you don't lie about a $600 bonus, right? Like, the right pretext, the right thought, the right meaning, the right partnership can really lead to, positive improvement in your security policy.
Yeah, I really like that. Going back and talking to them afterwards and giving them that feedback, like, "Hey, here's what I did, and here's what we can do better." Related to that, one of the things that we really try to avoid, it's actually included in the socialengineering.org ethics, but you really want to be careful with retaliation against the employees. So if someone falls for a fish, a phone call, tailgating, whatever it might be, you want to, yes, they might need training, which is fine. But if you start, firing people all of a sudden, you drop your morale. You don't get, like Jason said, you don't get that learning. I've had
Mhm.
phishing in the past where we called an organization and we tricked one person and they got the training. We talked with them. I talked with them. And the next year, that department was rock freaking solid because she's like, that's never going to happen again. And she learned the tips and the tricks when we talked to her and shut that down hard, let everybody know what was going on. And it was fantastic. You turned someone who needed a little bit of training now into one of your strongest allies.
Mhm.
Whereas if you had, terminated that person or punished them, they may have left, may have said, I don't care anymore. Now you've flipped that and hardened it and strengthened it. And now it becomes an asset instead of a liability.
And ultimately, my experience doing social engineering of all types, I've really learned that any person on the right day, in the
Yep.
right mood, with the right pretext, might click, might say yes over the phone, might hold that door open a little longer than they should have. And more often than not, it can be a matter of luck that I caught that one person and
Yep.
not the other person on the team that might be a little more rigorous. And just by the nature of firing 10 or 15 times, I'll have that success. So we have to be, um, we want to make sure that we're not, like Tim, like you had mentioned, Tim, blaming the one person. We're not firing that one person. We should be aware of, maybe we have a lack of security training. Maybe there's policy that we don't have written for people to follow when these questionable situations happen. And think of these issues more as being systemic as opposed to just being a quote unquote bad employee.
Yeah. And on top of that, you've got to have a culture where someone could say, you know what, I made a mistake and report it and not be in fear.
Yes.
Because if they're like, I clicked on this thing, but if I report it, I'm gonna get in trouble. So I'm just gonna pretend it never happened. I did this other thing and I'm just not gonna tell anybody so I don't get in trouble. No, ideally, the culture is, hey, you know what? I made a mistake. The prevention is part of it. Detection is the other I don't want to say half, it might even be more than a half. It's just critically important that when a mistake happens, people have the confidence, the comfort
Mhm.
in the organization to say, "Hey, look, I think that was an issue. I made a mistake," and they're like, "Cool, thanks for letting us know. You know, mistakes happen," and the organization can defend itself more quickly.
Absolutely.
Cool. Let's talk a little bit about reconnaissance. So reconnaissance here now, when we're learning about maybe a user, if you learn about a building, I mean, it's not going to hurt the building's feelings, right? Learning about computers don't care, but it can get a little bit. I don't want to say personal, but because you're grabbing information about a user. Now, one quick point I wanted to bring up here is in the U.S. if we're doing research on LinkedIn and such, it's I've never heard of a privacy law that prevents that in the US. Now, when it comes to Europe and European adjacent countries, Australia, Singapore, and some of the others, that now becomes an issue where we're gathering personal information. It might just simply be name and email address. Now we're grabbing some of that personal information. So it can be a little bit more difficult. Of course, the real bad guys, going to do this without flinching, right?
Mhm.
They're already breaking the law. They don't care. This is one of those limitations. And I get it, although it's harder, I'll be honest, as an American to get it. But I get it because you're trying to protect people. But, what's your thoughts on that, Jason?
Well, I mean, the first thought is, well, you're an American from Texas to make it even worse, right? Like you
Right?
all are
Yeah, yeah.
just, yeah, your own set of rules down
Pew, pew,
there.
pew.
um, but I agree. Even not necessarily from a law perspective, but just from like a being a decent human being perspective. It's like, sure,
Yeah.
I could theoretically, if I'm doing a physical engagement, I could walk up to somebody who's on their lunch break and be, verbally aggressive or try to get, too close in their space to steal their badge, or maybe they catch me like rummaging through their bag or whatever you want to call it. Like, I don't like to do that kind of stuff because, yeah, technically I might have permission, but I also might not, especially with dealing with individuals outside of their workplace. And I don't want to, catch a pickpocketing charge on a physical engagement because I did it offside, right?
Oh,
That's not
God.
what I want at all. Yeah. Once again, don't want to go to jail. um, but yeah, when it comes to that recon, a lot of times what people are sharing publicly on social media is typically enough, and I stop there. I don't need to go on some data broker site and find their home address and throw that in the report. And
Yep.
sure, maybe there's a use case for that somewhere, but a lot of times it's best just to stay away from it, whether it's legal or not, just from a morality standpoint.
Yeah, great. We talked through a lot of the different legal considerations around voice calls, GDPR versus US to some degree here, the permission up front. We spent a lot more time on some of the ethical considerations. More importantly, when you're interacting with people, because it's different. It's not just the legal piece. There's a lot more to that. People are complex. The environments that they work in are very complex. So it's important to think through what that actually looks like, how you're impacting not just the organization, but importantly, that
People.
one individual,
Mhm.
right? Any final thoughts, Jason?
Just in general, always err on the side of caution. If
Yep.
something seems like it's a little bit off, or you might get in trouble, or you might cause a bad day, just don't do it. And if you feel like it's necessary, make sure you get some sign off from as many people as possible. But ultimately, yeah, just err on the side of caution and always try to do the right thing. And remember that you win more support. Well, you win flies with honey, not with vinegar. So, take that with you and do what you will.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Jason Downey, consultant here at Red Siege Information Security. I'm Tim Medin, CEO, and we're wrapping up here another SiegeCast. If you want to get a hold of us for work, redsiege.com. Hit us up there. Hit us up on the tweeters, X, whatever you call it these days, at Red Siege, LinkedIn. Uh, any of the socials, hit us up there. Feel free to email me personally, Tim at redsiege.com. More than happy to talk to you folks, even if it's just questions about this. Of course, great spot is our Discord, redsiege.com/Discord. Keep the conversation going. And thanks so much for coming out.